Imagine this scenario. It's finally happening. China is moving to take Taiwan by force. Chinese warships are blockading the island of Taiwan and the surrounding area, while missiles and UAVs rain down destruction on the Taiwanese people from above. In this hypothetical scenario, what is Japan doing? This is a question of some urgency for Tokyo these days. For one thing, Japan's westernmost island is only about 110 kilometers away from Taiwan, much closer than it is to the Japanese mainland. Then, of course, there's the question of a more direct attack on the homeland. Japan hosts around 55,000 U.S. soldiers on 15 major bases. China could easily decide to target these sites. Given all that's at stake, how would Japan respond in a scenario that could lead to the world's first great power war since 1945? And in a clash between two superpowers, would Japan's contribution even matter? You're watching the Diplomat Asia. In this episode, we explain Japan's military and security strategy for a Taiwan contingency and why the United States' choices will be key to any action by Japan. Experts agree that the stakes are high for Japan.
The Taiwan Strait crisis is very much Japan's own issue. Just the geographic proximity between the southwestern tip end of Japanese territory and Taiwan, it almost makes it certain that any of those crisis situations could very much involve Japan's own national defense issue.
And Japan's decisions will have huge consequences. Japan's military may be far smaller than its American or Chinese counterparts, but various war games have concluded that Japan's participation in a Taiwan Strait conflict would be decisive. For example, a famous report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in 2023 concluded that the Japan-US alliance could together thwart an attempted invasion of Taiwan, but the US alone could not. In part, what Japan has to offer is simple geography. If the United States is not permitted to use its bases in Japan to conduct military operations in the Taiwan Strait, undertaking a defense of Taiwan would be effectively impossible. But Japan's own military contributions to a war effort would also be hugely important. Japan has the third largest military in East Asia, behind only China and South Korea. Japan has special capabilities in anti-submarine warfare and minesweeping that would be invaluable in a Taiwan Strait conflict. It also has advanced submarines of its own and two de facto aircraft carriers, which Japan refers to as destroyers, the JS Izumo and the JS Kaga. In addition, Japan operates its own fleet of advanced fighter jets, including F-35 stealth fighters and upgraded F-15s. Meanwhile, it's actively developing a counter-strike capability, effectively missile systems that could be used to attack China. So there's a lot that Japan could do to help defend Taiwan. But what it would do is an entirely separate discussion. For Japan, the question of when to use military force and what that would look like is extremely complicated, politically and legally. In recent years, some Japanese have argued that Japan should, in fact, come to Taiwan's defense in the case of an invasion. As former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo famously put it in 2021, a Taiwan emergency is a Japanese emergency, and therefore an emergency for the Japan-US alliance. But Abe was speaking as a private, though deeply influential, citizen. At the time, he'd been retired for over a year. Current Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae made a much bigger splash in November 2025 when she made a similar argument in a Diet session. Her comments on Taiwan so upset China that a Chinese diplomat called for her head to be cut off. Given all the fuss, Takaichi's actual comments might surprise you. When an opposition lawmaker pressed her on what circumstances could draw Japan into a Taiwan crisis, Takaichi laid out some red lines. If battleships are used and a naval blockade involves the use of force, I believe that would constitute a situation that could be deemed a threat to Japan's survival. The key words here are a threat to Japan's survival. That phrase has a very specific meaning in the context of Japan's legal framework for using military force, and that's why China went ballistic when Takaichi said those magic words. Japan's post-war constitution famously renounces the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. However, over the decades, Japan has carved out a number of exceptions. First, Japan, like every state, has the right to self-defense, as laid out in the United Nations Charter. Then, in 2014, under Abe, Japan's government expanded its interpretation of self-defense to include what's called collective self-defense, in essence, allowing for Japan to participate in military actions alongside its ally, the United States. Even then, it's not a blank check. There are strict legal thresholds that have to be met.
This situation of Japan supporting U.S. military operations in this hypothetical situation where U.S. military is involved to help Taiwan defend itself, this will be identified as the situation in the area surrounding Japan, which often is loosely understood as regional contingency. There are many rear area support that the Japan is committing itself to do by using self-defense forces assets, and also allowing U.S. military and access to self-defense force bases to move forces through Japan to deploy forward to Taiwan.
The dry bureaucratic language really matters in this case. It decides how far Japan can go in deploying its military without violating its own constitution. Adding to the confusion, Japan's response would heavily depend on something entirely outside of its control, whether and how the United States intervenes, and how China reacts. If you want us to keep digging into Asia's big geopolitical stories, hit like and subscribe. It tells us to make more videos. If Tokyo determines that a Chinese attack on Japan is imminent, the country is empowered to use force, even for a preemptive strike. But a survival-threatening situation, the language Takaichi used in the Diet hearing, only empowers Japan to engage in collective self-defense or military action alongside the United States.
What gets lost often when we talk about Japan's involvement or possible involvement in the Taiwan contingency is that it does not include Japan directly sending its troops to help Taiwan defend itself. What it comes down to is whether Japan supports U.S. operation. So everything that Japan may or may not do is very intimately linked with how U.S. makes its decisions.
If the U.S. decides not to assist Taiwan, then Japan won't act, because there's no collective self-defense to take part in. Even if the United States does intervene, it's unclear whether Japan's military could fight alongside U.S. troops in defense of Taiwan. A survival-threatening situation is supposed to apply only when U.S. troops are actively engaged in the defense of Japan. That's what made Takaichi's comment so provocative in China's mind. She was arguing that Japan's military could actually join a U.S. effort to defend Taiwan. But the distinction might be unnecessary, depending on how China responds to any U.S. involvement in a Taiwan Strait conflict. If U.S. forces act to defend Taiwan, China might launch missile attacks on the U.S. military bases in Japan. In that case, Japan would be directly impacted by a Taiwan emergency almost immediately, paving the way for Japan's full support of the activities of the U.S. military. Let's say that happens, and Japan does in fact engage in a Taiwan Strait conflict. Its options would still be limited, not only by the legal restrictions on Japan's military, but also by the strong anti-war sentiments among Japan's population.
It's not designed for Japan's self-defense force to send its troops to Taiwan, for example, to help Taiwan defend itself. That is, I think, one big misunderstanding that whatever Prime Minister Takaichi might have said on the Diet floor, what self-defense force will be authorized to do to defend its borders and to ensure the safety and lives of Japanese citizens in Taiwan.
If you're enjoying this video, visit thediplomat.com/subscriptions for more comprehensive coverage of Asia-Pacific geopolitics. Use code DIPASIA10, that's DIPASIA10 at checkout to get 10% off your first year's subscription. Don't imagine that Japan will automatically send troops or even warships and fighter jets to defend Taiwan. Its contribution is likely to look very different, not fighting on the front line, but providing what's called rear area support.
What Japan's self-defense force specifically will offer is, first and foremost, provision of logistical support. So that includes transport of supplies, medevac also probably will be included as such. Japan would also relieve some of the burdens off of U.S. forces to protect its own bases in Japan. So those are some of the things that this rear area supports could include.
Even these Japanese capabilities, combined with the United States' own formidable military, could turn the tide. Remember the CSIS study from 2023 that I mentioned earlier? It forecast a victory by Japan in the US, but it came at a steep cost. CSIS predicted the loss of thousands of troops, hundreds of aircraft, and dozens of ships for both the US and Japan. And that's one of the more optimistic scenarios. Other war games have predicted an outright defeat for the Allies. Is the Japanese public, long known for its pacifist tendencies, ready to pay such a cost? Increasingly, experts say the answer is yes, and that's in part due to China's own aggressive behavior.
Well, I think China is really misreading all this. And I just don't think they realize the accumulation of their bad behavior for the last decade is really, they're undercutting themselves. Japanese public will likely sanction self-defense forces involvement because there is a public that are more receptive to Japan's participating in the U.S.-led effort to help Taiwan defend itself.
Thanks for watching the Diplomat Asia. If you're interested in Japan-U.S. security cooperation, you can learn more about the multilateral context in our video on the Quad grouping, and leave a comment below if there's a topic you'd like to see covered in a future video.